Snow drifted down from a colorless sky, soft as ash and quiet as regret. The ranch was still, except for the faint whinny of a horse and the distant creak of the barn door fighting the wind. Inside the wooden cabin, Clara stirred a pot of stew over the fire. Her sleeves rolled to the elbows, cheeks flushed from heat and heartbreak. It had been another long winter alone. She wasn't young anymore, at least not by frontier standards. Her figure was soft, her hands calloused, and her heart heavier than she'd ever admit. Folks in town said things when they thought she couldn't hear. No one marries a fat girl. Not out here. She'd smile politely, hold her chin high, and walk away. But their words followed her home like wolves in the dark. That evening, the door creaked open, bringing in a gust of icy wind and a man. A tall stranger, broad-shouldered, dusted with snow, his hat low over his eyes. "Ma'am," he said, voice deep and rough like gravel, "my horse went lame. I need shelter till morning." Clara's fingers trembled on the ladle, but she nodded. "Come in, sir. The storm's mean tonight." He stepped in, his boots heavy on the floorboards, melting snow trailing behind. The firelight caught the hard planes of his face, a man used to work, to silence, to loss. "Name's Eli," he said simply, removing his hat. "Clara," she replied. For a while, they didn't speak. Only the crackle of fire and the bubbling stew filled the room. Eli watched her move, steady, capable, kind. She wasn't delicate like the women in town. She was real, solid, alive. When she served him a bowl, she tried to smile. "It's not much," she said, "but I can cook." Eli took a bite, then another. The flavor hit him rich, honest, warm. "Miss," he said finally, meeting her eyes, "this is the best damn stew I've ever had." She laughed softly, embarrassed. "No one marries a fat girl." "Sir," she murmured before she could stop herself. "But I can cook." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Eli set down his spoon slowly. "Who told you that nonsense?" Clara looked away, but he didn't. His gaze softened, not out of pity but understanding. Outside, the snow thickened. The wind howled, and somewhere between the storm and the silence, something began to change. Eli leaned back in his chair, the firelight painting lines of gold across his weathered face. Clara busied herself with the dishes, trying to hide the tremor in her hands. She wasn't used to company, especially not a man like him. There was something about his quiet that made her chest tighten, as if every unspoken word between them had weight. When she turned, she found him watching her, not with judgment, but with something else, something she didn't dare name. "You live out here alone?" he asked, his tone low and gentle. "Mostly," she said, setting the bowl aside. "My pa built this place before he passed. Been keeping it running ever since. Folks in town trade me supplies for my bread and stew." Eli nodded slowly, eyes wandering around the cabin. Everything was simple, but cared for. The neatly mended curtains, the stacked firewood, the quilts folded on the bed. It told a story of a woman who worked hard and asked for nothing. "Must get lonely," he murmured. Clara gave a half smile. "Lonely's not the worst thing. Disappointment is." Eli's brow furrowed. "Someone disappointed you." She hesitated, then sighed. "A long time ago, a man promised to marry me, said he didn't care what others said. But when his family found out, they called me names, said a rancher's wife should look fine in a dress, not fill it out." He stopped coming after that. The silence that followed was heavy as snow. Eli's hand tightened on the mug he held. "Fools," he muttered. "They wouldn't know a good woman if she was standing right in front of them." Clara blinked, unsure if she'd heard him right. "You don't have to say that," she whispered. He met her gaze, unwavering. "I don't say what I don't mean." The fire crackled, throwing sparks into the air. For the first time in years, Clara felt something stir inside her, something like warmth, but not from the hearth. "You should rest," she said quietly, trying to steady her breath. "The spare room's through there." He rose, towering over her, then tipped his hat. "Thank you, ma'am," when he disappeared into the small room. Clara stood still for a long while, listening to the wind howl outside. She touched her chest, where her heart beat too fast, and smiled faintly. The storm had brought trouble before, but maybe this time it had brought a chance. Clara woke before dawn, the cabin still wrapped in a hush that came only after a long storm. The fire had died down to glowing embers, and the faint gray of morning filtered through the frosted window. For a moment, she almost thought Last night had been a dream until she heard the soft sound of movement from the spare room. Eli was awake. She poured water into a basin, brushed the snow from her coat, and began preparing breakfast. The smell of biscuits and coffee filled the cabin just as he stepped out, freshly washed, his hair damp and shirt sleeves rolled. "You're up early," he said, his voice softer than the night before. "Old habits," she replied, smiling faintly. "When you run a place alone, mornings come too soon." He nodded, then glanced around, noticing how carefully everything was arranged, each plate in its place, the herbs hanging near the window, the old clock ticking steady. "You've built a fine life here," he said. Clara laughed quietly. "A small one, maybe, but it's mine." They sat together at the table, steam rising from their cups. For a while, they ate in silence until Eli finally spoke. "About what you said last night." Her cheeks warmed instantly. "Forget it. I talk too much when I'm nervous." "No," he said firmly. "I don't forget words that carry truth." He leaned forward slightly, eyes steady. "You said no one marries a fat girl, but that's not what I see. I see a woman who works harder than most men I know, who kept her land when others sold theirs, who makes a cabin feel like a home with nothing but her to hands." Clara's throat tightened, her fingers curling around her cup. No one had ever spoken of her like that. "You don't have to flatter me, Eli." He shook his head. "I'm not. I've seen plenty of women chasing pretty dresses and fancy talk, but they don't know how to survive a winter. You do." The wind outside whispered through the cracks of the old cabin, carrying the scent of snow and pine. Clara looked down, blinking back tears she hadn't realized were there. "You'll be gone by noon, I suppose?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Maybe, depends if my horse is ready or if the stew's better than the road." She laughed, a sound light enough to chase away the cold for a moment. As the sun broke through the clouds, spilling gold across the snow, Clara realized something had shifted. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was seen. The morning light grew stronger, spilling across the cabin floor in soft golden streaks. Clara busied herself with small chores, folding linens, feeding the hens, pretending her heart wasn't restless. Eli had gone outside to check on his horse, and every sound of the barn door or crunch of snow made her chest flutter. She hadn't felt this alive in years, and it frightened her. When he finally returned, the brim of his hat dusted white, she was kneading bread by the fire. "Your horse?" she asked without turning. "Better," he said, "but I think he could use another day's rest." She smiled to herself, hands deep in flour. "Well then, you'll just have to suffer through more of my cooking." Eli chuckled, setting his gloves on the table. "I reckon I can manage that." For a while they moved around each other with an easy rhythm, like to old friends who had known each other far longer than a single night. He chopped wood. She baked and hummed quietly. The storm had broken, but something warmer had settled in its place, a fragile peace neither wanted to end. As dusk came, they sat together on the porch, watching the last of the sun melt into the horizon. The world was painted gold and blue, the air crisp and still. Clara handed him a mug of coffee, their fingers brushing for just a second longer than needed. "You'll leave tomorrow," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Eli nodded slowly. "The trail calls, but..." He stopped, looking out at the white fields stretching endlessly ahead. Sometimes a man spends so long moving that he forgets what it's like to have a reason to stay. Clara's breath caught, her heart stumbling in her chest. "And do you think you found one?" she asked, meeting his eyes. His gaze was steady, the kind that saw straight through pretense. "Maybe I have." The silence that followed was tender, filled with everything they didn't yet have the courage to say. Later, when he rose to turn in, she stood to clear the cups. But before stepping inside, he paused at the door. "Clara," he said softly, "you ever think maybe folks were wrong about you?" She blinked, confused. "Wrong? About what they said? About who deserves love?" His words hung between them like the soft fall of snow. She looked at him, her voice trembling. "I stopped thinking about that a long time ago." He smiled faintly, eyes kind. "Then maybe it's time you start again." That night, Clara lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of the wind outside. She thought of his words, of his steady hands and quiet strength, and a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. For the first time in years, Hope felt real like spring waiting beneath the snow.